So that's a portrait of Richard the this is Richard III, painted in the 1590s. In the early 1500s. Some years after his death, roughly 20 years after his death. And look, he's fiddling with his ring. Is he anxious? Does he feel he doesn't deserve to be king? So there was the Wars of the Roses, and between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. He's a Yorkist, Richard of York, and his father had effectively overthrown Henry VI. His father, the Duke of York, had wanted to kill Henry VI, but just simply maybe use him as a figurehead and effectively rule. But anyway, he predeceased Henry VI. Don't want to go into too much of the story. Henry VI was very mentally ill from 1553 when he was about 32 years old. This is a replica of Richard III's skull, so you can see the curvature there. But under thick robes, it wouldn't have been that blatant. What we reckon his suit of armour would have been looked like because he was buried naked, completely naked, not even a shroud. What else about Richard III? He was the younger brother of King King Edward IV, and when his brother died, Edward IV in Ludlow Castle, on the 9th of April, 1483, it was due to be Edward IV's own son, Richard of Shrewsbury, and then his obviously younger son also, and Edward, who was to take over. What was I going to say? Edward IV was due to take over. Sorry, why do I keep getting this wrong? Edward the Fifth. Yeah. So anyway, Richard III had his sister-in-law arrested, Elizabeth Woodville and the Woodvilles, and then his nephews, the princes of the Tower and the Tower of London, didn't have the sinister reputation back then that it has today. And then a sermon was preached saying that really Elizabeth Woodville wasn't probably married to Edward IV, so therefore Edward V wasn't the rightful king, nor would his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury be a rightful king, so therefore Richard III was to be the rightful king. Anyway, so they weren't seen again. There was some sort of rebellion, an attempt to free them in July 1483. But then they disappeared. Were they murdered? Very probably. Obviously, you can't prove that conclusively so many years later. There was an investigation under Edward VIII many years later, which concluded that they were suffocated on the orders of Richard III. Their bodies have never been recovered. They have found corpses of boys of roughly the right age, sort of age 10 and 12, in the Tower of London, buried under the staircase. They were found in the late 17th century. It's actually not the princess in the Tower. What else about Richard III? So yeah. Here he is laid to rest in Greyfriars Abbey. Friars being monks who wore grey cloaks or grey habits, frère, as in brother in French. Monks are known as brothering by those who are not their brothers. They're meant to live as brothers. Polydore Virgil, one of the main chroniclers of the era. Polydore is in many gifts. So had a quick burial, and deposed kings were usually buried outside London, as happened with Richard II, as happened with Henry VI in Chertsey Abbey, subsequently reinterred in Windsor Castle, where he was born. Anyway, so Shakespeare came along, and in the 1590s, that's when Shakespeare wrote his play, Richard III, in which he really introduced Richard III. So that's sort of Tudor propaganda, because the Tudors won. The red roses of Lancaster defeated the white roses of York. And it's from one of these plays, I think it's Henry VI, that Shakespeare invented the story of how they chose their roses in the Temple Garden in London, the red rose, the white rose. They weren't known as the Wars of the Roses till the 19th century, and Sir Walter Scott dubbed it that. But look, things written in praise of him about Richard III. Like a spirited, most courageous prince, Richard fell in battle and not in flight. And here's John Rouse. He bore himself like a noble soldier and honourably defended himself to his last breath. Bear in mind they're writing after his death, when his enemy, Henry VII, was king. So you think you'd only say that if it really were true, because it'd be a bit risky to say anything complimentary about Richard III, who was not allowed to reward you, who was dead. His supporters either had to quickly come over to the side of Henry VII or face condign punishment. So Richard III was king for just over 2 years. His nephews disappeared. He'd had titulus regius revealed, this document saying that they were illegitimate and therefore had no right to the throne. In those days, being born outside of marriage was regarded as disgraceful. They had no inheritance rights because Elizabeth Woodville had previously been engaged to somebody else. You might think that's rather slender ground to declare them illegitimate. So he had himself crowned in July 1483, and so then he faced various rebellions and overthrown a short time later. So yeah, his elder brother Edward IV had been king for some time. Yeah, one of the classic images of Richard III again, and here was that Lancastrian leader, founder of Eton, Henry VI. Okay, king at the age of 9 months from 1422, founded Eton in 1440 at the age of 19, and then he was overthrown in 1460. And he was then came back to the throne in 1470, overthrown again in 1471, and killed in the Tower of London on the 23rd of May, just after the Battle of Tewkesbury, when his son Edward of Westminster was slain at the age of 17. So what else should I say about significant people? So here's Elizabeth Woodville, the one who didn't come from an aristocratic family, really. Her father had been a knight, so not a peasant, not even bourgeois, but really the bottom end of the upper class. Didn't have the title Lord. But though her mother was the daughter of the Duke of Luxembourg, Luxembourg was actually very petty by the end of that time. So she had Elizabeth Woodville. She's the one who married Edward IV, the elder brother of Richard III. Okay, other significant players. Here's Henry VIII, who's 28 at the time of the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. So he was born in Wales. His father was also, his grandfather was also Welsh. His grandfather previously married Catherine de Valois, the wife of the late Henry V. Anyway, he'd fled to Brittany, was in Brittany. Brittany was not part of France at the time. The Bretons were persuaded to arrest him, hand him over to Richard III, but he was tipped off. He fled to France. The French took up his side, gave him 2,000 soldiers. He sailed to Wales, landed, raised his banner, and in only 15 days, marched from Pembrokeshire to Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth was fought. So if I were a betting man at the time of the Battle of Bosworth, I would have bet upon Richard III winning. He outnumbered Henry VII 2-1, other things like that. He was the reigning king. His troops were fresher, whereas Henry VII had a long march, and so on. And some of them were just very fresh volunteers with no training. And though the Stanley family, which is a major landowning family in the Midlands, and the Stanleys had come in on the side of Richard III, his numerical advantage would have been 3-1, maybe even 4-1, but they were neutral. So he took the precaution of having the Stanley's son, Lord George Strange, as a hostage. And when the Stanleys didn't join Richard III's side, he ordered the boy to be executed. Fortunately for the soldier, ordered to do that, he didn't do it, because we now know Richard III lost. And if he'd killed Lord George Strange, what would have been done to him? Anyway, look at this, Kingmaker Warwick. So Richard III married Warwick's daughter. So whichever side he was on won the battle. He was later killed in a battle, possibly by mistake. It's really unclear what happened. Okay, so that's Richard Neville. Anne Neville, his daughter, was the wife of Richard III. Richard III had one son who was made Prince of Wales, who died of natural causes as a teenager a few weeks before the Battle of Bosworth. Okay, so George, Duke of Clarence is Richard III's middle brother. Richard III is the youngest of the three, and he was beheaded in Yorkshire because he opened negotiations with the Lancastrian side to go over to them. He was not drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, as Shakespeare tells us. Okay, they say it's a cursed title, Duke of Clarence. Anyway, so enough of these characters here. Look how big these swords were, halberds. Okay, you can stab with that. You can drag a horseman off his horse with things like this. So lots of battles. I mentioned the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest day in English history by some reckoning, fought in a snowstorm in Yorkshire in 1461. So you can see the battles are mostly English Midlands. Began with the first Battle of St Albans in 1455. There was a second Battle of Albans in 1461. Really fought in the streets there. So all the battles were in England, none of them were in Wales. Ireland were actually somewhat involved, but I won't go into that. Scotland not, although Henry VI did flee to Scotland, was there for several years when he was overthrown. See this replica of the throne. Anyway, that's enough for the moment about dear old Richard III. I warmly recommend coming here to this visitor centre. Very atmospheric, very informative, interactive, and so on. Okay, and so that car park was what it was found. They've integrated that so you can see his last resting place. Anyway, thank you for watching my video. Make sure you subscribe on PayPal, on Patreon. Donate on PayPal, George Callahan 79. at gmail.com. Goodbye.